Okay, Bear. So, introduce us. Tell us your full name and where you were born.
My full name is Anthony John Bradshaw. Anthony, not Anthony. I think I was probably called Anthony because Anthony Eden was quite a prominent politician in those days. I was born in the village of Norton, which is about 5 miles north of Gloucester, off the Gloucester-Tewkesbury Road, on the 1st of June, 1928.
And do you know anything about the day that you were born?
All I can do is what other people said. When I was born, and it was home confinement, as most things were in those days, and the family helped. I was put aside as dead. And my father's mother tried to revive me, and she did. But in the time, I suffered oxygen starvation on the left side of my brain, which has been with me ever since. I've been fortunate, really. Ultimately, it was diagnosed at Southampton Hospital. And of more recent times, when they've been doing x-rays of my brain, they can point out the damage that took place. So that's been some of the reason why, well, sometimes I haven't been as fit as I might be. And, suffering from transglobal amnesia, for instance, and the like.
And do you know why it was that you were left when you were born?
Why?
Why you were left when you were born?
Well, in those days, children were 2 a penny. It was the mothers that mattered. And they thought I was dead. And this is one of the problems with limited space, home confinements, lack of services and the like, that one is almost on top of one another. But the primary thing was the mother. But I can't remember that. That's all what I've been told.
Yeah. And tell us about your parents.
Well, my father was born in 1897. Unfortunately, either just before he was born or shortly afterwards, his father, who had a cycling business, did something which the fact was he died following an accident. In those days, there was no social care, so my grandmother had to go out to work. That really meant domestic work, where one would be housed and fed. Well, father was brought up in an orphanage, and he went to an orphanage really when he was a baby. I've got a note there from the curate saying that Alfred was christened on a certain day, and he stayed at that orphanage, which was provided by Gladstone, who was many times a Liberal, not only just a Liberal MP, but he was a Prime Minister several times. He stayed there, and I got photographs of him in choir outfits and the orphanage uniform. He stayed till he was 14 at school, and then worked on the estate and lived in the bothy which is above the stables. But then when he came to military age, he thought he should tell his mother. Now, she was in service at that time in Bournemouth. He came down to Bournemouth. The toffs used to move around, you see, different times of the year. He came down to Bournemouth to tell her that he was going to join the army, and he signed on at Poole. He sent to Dorchester to spend his first night in the army, and subsequently at Chickerell, Bovington before any tanks. And then he was in the 1st Dorsets. When he got to France, he was transferred into the 1st Wiltshire Regiment, because I believe the Wiltshire Regiment had been shot up rather badly. On April the 9th, 1917, at the Battle of Arras, which is fairly close to where the Canadians were fighting as well, at Vimy Ridge, they'd been out patrolling the night before, and all of a sudden heard a strange noise. They were sheltering in a shell hole, looked out, the first tanks they'd ever seen, and with that a piece of German shrapnel hit him in the face. Among the things we could do when we were children, an odd privilege, was to feel Father's teeth, because they were in his tongue. They didn't want to remove all the teeth from the mouth, but nonetheless, he was in hospital, I think, for about a couple of years and didn't never gain in any service. My mother was one of 19 children. They didn't all live, and nonetheless, she left school before she was 14 with a special certificate because they had certain standard of education, and I've got a copy of that certificate as well. My mother and father were married in 1919, of December, I think it was. And they went to live in a village outside of Gloucester because he'd been advised to have a job in a rural location in respect of his health. So they went, and there was a gentleman who was an ex-army captain who was interested in employing ex-service people. So he went to Norton and was employed there. The cottage they had was this very small cottage. The rent was £10 a year, providing you continued to live in there and work on the estate. Well, Father wasn't very well from time to time. I remember the time when George V died, at 20th of January 1936. Father was in hospital, I remember. But when the World War came, obviously they probably looked for something better to do. Mother had been in the munitions factory in the First World War. But anyway, Father left the estate and the landlord wanted to get him out. But nonetheless, the government made a decree that people shouldn't be turned out if they were going on to war work. So Father went to work at a place called Rotal Air Screws. Rotal Air Screws was a firm that was a joint effort from Bristol Airplane Company and Rolls-Royce to make propellers, constant speed units, and all that sort of thing to do with aircraft. It was built in 1936. Both of them, strange enough, worked in the tool room, very precise. And Father was an internal thread grinder, which is not very straightforward, and Mother was working on grinding to a tenth of a thousandth of an inch, because in the aeronautical industry, then that really does matter. The Father died when he was, well, he died in 1955. Mother lived till she was 81.
And what was your relationship like with each of them as you were growing up?
Well, you appreciate, I mean, my sisters and brother, if I say Betty was born in 1920, Joan in 1922, Peter in 1927, myself in 1928, Beryl in 1930, Mary in 1931, and Dorothy in 1935. So as a family unit, we got on, which was very good. And of course, let's accept the fact that poverty was there. But we were always well fed, most vegetables out of the garden, and the odd chicken at Christmas because we used to keep a few fowls. And yes, our relations was very good. And, well, always have been, I'm glad to say.
Do you have a particularly fond memory of growing up in Norton?
Well, it was in a village and things were very pleasant. So what with the school, the church and the like, and the family and friends, and occasionally doing an odd bit of work. And I always used to go out and shut up chickens in about 3 or 4 fields for a farmer. He used to pay me 3 and 6pence a week. And at harvest time, I worked on the farm, and you could get 2 and 6pence a day. So that didn't go far, but we had a rule in our house that whatever was earned by any of the children, mother would have half. It may seem not really a very nice thing to ask for, but I can consider very much the necessity for it.
And was there anything in particular that you'd like to do as a family together?
Well, as a family, it was very difficult. First thing was transport. I mean, I didn't have a bicycle until I was 11, and that was a second-hand ladies' bike with skirt guards on the back wheels, and really there was no money. I mean, I think in 1938, my father's pay was £3, 14 shillings a fortnight. Well, by the time we paid the rent and the children's clothes and whatnot, I'm afraid we never ever went on a holiday together. I remember once when Father and Mother went to the Isle of Wight for a holiday because one of Mother's brothers was there, and while they were away, I'm afraid I tried to be helpful in the garden and got a hook to cut down the vines of the peas and caught one of my younger sister's legs that had about 10 stitches in it. So that wasn't very satisfactory, was it?
And what do you think the most important lesson that your parents taught you has been?
I think the most important was the manners. Thank you, please, and the general courtesy. Ladies first, and always to be presentable. Now, there were not very good clothes, I mean, but nonetheless, Sunday was a different day, and we, all right, dressed up. But our main thing was to be considerate to other people, and as I say, have manners, and also work. You get nothing without work and effort.
And at school, did you have a favourite subject?
Well, you see, when you look at school in those days, I went to school when I was 4, and it was a village school, about 80 odd pupils in 3 classes. The fresh ones were in a separate room, and there were 2 classes in one long room, heated with a tortoise coke stove, and nonetheless we had a good time at school. The headmaster was a little bit bossy. Strange part about him, he always frightened of thunder. If there was any thunder around, he'd go back to his house and that. But nonetheless, I was interested in things to do with geography and mathematics. But of course, this school changed from being a full school from 5 till 14 to 5 to 11. And I was 11 in 1939. We had to change schools. Well, the headmaster wanted my brother and myself to go to grammar school. Father said, "You boys are only gun fodder for the next war." I can appreciate the fact that what he'd gone through in the First World War, and also that one of my elder sisters went to grammar school and they couldn't afford the uniform. So, in spite of the constant pleading, Father wouldn't allow us to be even considered for grammar school. So therefore, we went to a senior council school, which was perhaps 4 miles away, which a bus picked us up and took us there. And all I would say is, it was a very happy school. mainly, but to begin with, we couldn't go to school when we were supposed to until the air raid shelters were built in September 1939. Then, what did we find? We had a teacher who was of military age, so he wasn't with us many weeks before he was called up. And then another person, and he was called up, and the likes of that. And I would say that we were, although we were the top class educationally in the year, we were the worst behaved. And therefore, the next year, they put us onto the most strict teacher in the school, Marion Shelswell. She ultimately got married. Her name was Mrs. Hemming. But she was one who'd have a joke at the right time, but expected you to get down to it. And nonetheless, it was a very happy school, but you appreciate the stringent times that one had. You didn't have towels in the cloakrooms, things like that. I mean, things were really tight. It's very difficult for people today to appreciate the fact. And I mean, things like oranges or bananas, you didn't see them for years. So, but we enjoyed school.
And did you have many friends when you were at school?
Oh, yes, yes. I had, it was a mixed school, but nonetheless we were fairly young, so there was not much association with the boys and the girls. But I remember the school, there was a desk for two people, and the chappie in his name was Ronald Norman. He came from Birmingham, he was evacuated, and he came from Birmingham. And we were great friends. And another laddie who could never understand why he was christened that way, Dennis Alfred William Thomas Godfrey Heggie. Unfortunately, when he left school, he went to work on the railway, and in a shunting accident, he was killed. So we had some good friends. We worked together, and well, yes, we enjoyed it. The other thing, of course, was got to remember, a school like that had a canteen, which provided us on payment with a lunch. And in those stringent times, then it was very, very good.
And was there any time that you got into trouble, either at home or with your school friends?
Well, in school, we came from a village school. The other ones came from, the other children came from largely more urban area. And they used to get away with eating sweets in school in the tail end of 1939. And then first time I did it, the headmaster was looking through the door. And I'm afraid that's the only time I had a cane in school, when I had a one stripe on the left hand. We did have a bit of a schmozzle by playing around with, where we managed to break the glass in the school classroom door. But nonetheless, I mean, it was, yes, we got on very well. And the friends, I'm still friendly with one of the lads who was in our school. He lives up in Gloucester, and I speak to him and his wife, and when I'm up there, we go and see him.
And what's his name?
Dennis Williams.
And there's a story about your brother Peter scrumping for cider.
Well, you see, we were fortunate. The relationship between the farmers and the village lads was quite good. And the farm close to us, Spires was the name of the farmer. At harvest time, we used to go and help him. And Peter's job was to lead the horses and wagons out from the rickyard into the field, and then to return the loaded ones back. My job was actually loading on the wagons to put the sheaves in the right order, so the thing didn't fall over. But one day, Peter couldn't find him. The wagon was there, and in the end we found him under a stook of sheaves. He had too much cider, because you see, in that area most farmers had fruit orchards, and practically every farmer made cider. And one of the things that it was, yes, that day in the wind farming, see, there was a cider house, and the person leading the horses out would be given the job of replenishing the cider out in the field. So probably that's why Peter had too much. But there were different varieties of cider made with different apples, Kingston Black and there's all that, which was quite interesting. But in the village generally, when my particular friend and myself used to, in the evening, wherever we were, they, come and have it, go down the cellar. And then the tendency was, if there were 2 or 4 of you, whatever number, you'd fill a pint mug, and it was expected to be emptied in one round. And you all drank out of the same one. And then after that, let's try this. This is a Perry from the Nottingfield. And I never had too much to drink.
And so on, yes.
No, but nonetheless, it was very, very, socially interesting, if you like.
And when did you leave school, and what did you do
I left school at the end of July 1942.
And what did you go on to do?
I wanted to be an electrician. And I got a job in the maintenance department at this Rothal firm. And my brother was an engineering apprentice, and he was only a year older than me. But they said, we aren't taking electrical apprentices until you're 16. So I worked as an electrician's mate for 2 years. That 2 years was very interesting. I was always interested in aircraft and whatnot. It was one of the times first time I've been in an aeroplane, Avro Anson, took off in Staverton Airfield, which was right opposite the factory. And we had different groups of people. We had a spotters club, officially run with examinations and all that. And we had a place up on the tower of the factory roof so that we could go up and identify aircraft. And once the announcement was made of D-Day, I spent the D-Day morning up there looking for German planes that didn't come. Because the idea, in a factory that employing several thousand people, you wouldn't send them to their air raid shelters unless any enemy aircraft were in close proximity, because there were a lot of false alarms and the like. And yes, and a number of us, we were asked if we would volunteer for when the invasion came to go on ships, because the Navy would shoot anything down, go on ships to identify aircraft. But there were so many volunteers that we weren't wanted. But when you consider then, how old was I D-Day, June the 6th, my birthday, June the 1st, I was 16, just 16 on D-Day. And there was a lot of responsibility put on maybe, some of the younger people, which, yes, we enjoyed it. And I also gave my first lot of blood a few days before D-Day, because the Army blood transfusion service came around. And since then, I can't give it now because I'm too old, but I gave it 86 times, which I was very pleased to do.
And what was life like during the war, growing up as a 16-year-old boy at the start, and then obviously older as it progressed?
You went to work. Transport, it was a bicycle. There was something to be said for belonging to clubs. A club, Young Farmers Club, was in Gloucester, was very good. A lot of towns had young farmers clubs, and they would run competitions. We'd have lectures, and it was very nice. Occasionally, when we went in there, occasionally afterwards we'd go to the fish and chip shop, because fish and chips weren't rationed. We go to the cinema now and again, but you used to have to queue to get into the cinema, and then when the film ended, some people would come out and we managed to get in perhaps. But, and we spent our time, as much as anything, on village things. We had a Bible class regularly, we had the church, the choir, and well, even we had dancing classes, and that was held in what we used to call the assembly rooms, but actually it was the room at a public house, a skittle alley. So it was narrow and long, but nonetheless, at that time we didn't have a village hall. Subsequently, we did have a village hall. I was the secretary of the village hall as I got a little bit older, and I suppose I would have been, well, it would be tail end of 1946, and we bought a building, a second-hand building from the Forest of Dean, erected it. A farmer gave us the land to put it on, and we had a village hall, and that was very good. But since then they've had a new up-to-date hall built, which is very good. But one thing in a village we've got to remember, there are people who will do things. It makes a lot of difference.
And how long were you at Rotol?
Well, the point is, then I said, well, when the 2 years is up, what about, oh, we aren't going to take apprentices. Well, that shattered me, really. And in the meantime, I got friendly with the farmers and also somebody who was running the technical development people on the War Agricultural Executive Committee, and they were looking for somebody coming on, to do various things, and I was tempted. I was a bit cross with Rotol, so anyway, the fact that I went there, and while I was there, I was only 16. I used to drive a tractor on the road without a license, but nonetheless, that's what I did. But I think it showed that really I was more interested, well, agriculture was rather different. I mean, wartime means demand for manufactured military equipment, but after that, there isn't the same demand. Whereas, of course, at this time, I mean, practically every food was rationed, although bread was not rationed until after the war. And of course, there would be the problem in the 1944-45 of feeding some of the liberated countries in Europe. So there was a great demand for food, and agriculture had pulled their weight pretty well in ploughing up land and planting cereals, even growing potatoes on suitable land. But nonetheless, I was, interested in that, and well, even that I took the ploughing as well, and I had so many certificates for ploughing, first-class prizes, that they told me I shouldn't enter anymore, so I didn't. But that was really where I started off.
And how did you get into the ministry from there?
Well, very interesting. The 1946 to 7, I remember I changed in 44. Then things got a little different from the financial point of view, contributions from the government departments to various other departments. And I thought, well, I'd done a little bit of lecturing, or speaking would be the right word, at Hartpury Farm Institute, and also to some ex-service people on training days and the like, and instruction. But nonetheless, I thought, well, dear me, there was a job advertised in Bedfordshire for somebody with experience on combining, which I'd had. And this person, well, the farmer's wife had lost her husband in the war, and she married a friend of his, ex-major, and anyway, because of their relationship with people in Canada, they managed to buy a combine, self-propelled Massey Harris combine, and the fact was, of course, in England you couldn't get a combine unless you were allocated one. So I went there in the July 1947. Wow. Then it was a very fine summer. I think we worked about these 4 weeks without evening and evening off. And I mean, all right, the pay was all right, but anyway, it was partly a question of experience and the like. And then I had a letter from, actually, he was only a lorry driver, but a very able, competent, and helpful chap who people trusted him. And he said, "Would you like to come back?" Because they'd organised a series of 5-week courses for about 14 or 15 ex-servicemen at a time who were in residential accommodation in hostels. And the person who was going to teach them, he was an ex-army major. Unfortunately, he got light fingers, and they were almost desperate for someone to teach. So hence, I came down, and they said, well,
And where was this to?
Now this was in Gloucestershire, at Stoke Orchard. Stoke Orchard was an airfield that was constructed for glider training, and it was closed airfield then. I mean, the room we used to lecture in was a sort of the pilot's room with even the boards were up there with pilot and Hotspur glider and this and the other. And so I lectured, or taught, if you like, each course for 5 weeks. Nowadays, you think we've probably got 2 or 3 people to do that, but you don't. Well, anyway, then it was suggested the following year that I applied for a job with the National Agricultural Advisory Service. Well, I did. And I was invited for interview. Odd sort of things when you're applying for a job, people spy on you, don't you? I mean, I remember one senior chappie was sitting outside the door listening to my lecture, and he was one of the ones that had to give a report. But nonetheless, that was in 1948. We had, in our Gloucester Young Farmers Club, we had won a competition for binder packing, and there was a binder competition to eliminate the other counties in the southwest at Dunkeswell in Devon. So we went and we won the competition. And then the final was at the Royal Agricultural Show in York. It so happened the same day that I was interviewed in London to work for the ministry. Well, the civil service is always a long time. You probably, it's July when you're interviewed, it's the end of August, and then you start in the beginning of November. So obviously I continued doing a lot of this teaching. When I say teaching, a lot of it lecturing, a lot of it practical,
For the ministry.
Pardon?
For the ministry.
For the ministry, that's right. And actually I had less pay when I joined the ministry than I did being with the Agricultural Committee.
But still based in Gloucestershire.
Oh yes. Well then, that was in 1948. we did a fair amount of, all right, if I said to you, how would you harvest white clover seed or whatnot, what I mean? Well, when I'd done these things, and you could teach other people how to do it, and the various things. But anyway, in 1951, in fact, there were two of us in Gloucestershire. Strange enough, he lived in Sussex, but his home was in Sussex, but I think he had another girlfriend in Gloucester. He'd won the George Cross in the war for rescuing a crew from a burning plane. But nonetheless, George Winter was his name. They said to me, how would you like to go to Dorset? I said, I don't want to go to Dorset. But in the end it was, will you or won't you, and no beating about the bush. So, are you then, what do you do? I found out why I had to come after, but I did mention to friends that I knew who were at an agricultural show, the Three Counties show in Gloucestershire in June. It had recently followed a show at just outside Dorchester, and they said, people, when you know people, oh yeah, well I'm mad, I got to go to Dorset. Oh yeah. They said, if you want somewhere to stay, because the ministry would pay for a month's subsistence, it's worth going to the Seven Stars at East Burton, near Wool. The road's very rough, pothole, post-war job and all that, but nonetheless it's very good. So I had this appointment to come down on July the 4th for interview, for a job that I didn't want. A friend of mine came down for the ride, and I had this interview for the job I didn't want, and afterwards we went down to Weymouth to look at, and then went around to the Seven Stars to see what it was like. Well, that was changed my life completely. Inside the Seven Stars, we called it the bar if you like, was a lady and her mother. And all right, we got into conversation. That was on the 4th of July. She thought I was an officer from Bovington Camp. Anyway, the strange part is I didn't find out till after that my girlfriend in Gloucestershire, which, is all very well, the distance is not, she was a publican's daughter. They'd gone to the Seven Stars because they knew Mr. Evans. They used to swap, when they were short of gin or whiskey and all that, and they'd been out picking rhododendrons and just happened to call in. So, so happens that my girlfriend in Gloucestershire was a publican's daughter. So was this lady in the Seven Stars, and she was a church organist, the same as the one in Gloucestershire. Anyway, that was that. I moved down here on the 23rd of July, 1951. Why? And why me? But it so happened my predecessor had resigned. They wanted somebody who'd been used to teaching to lecture at Kingston Moorwood 2 mornings a week. And the liaison between the ministry and education was far very much easier. I mean, I didn't get paid a penny for it extra, but nonetheless I lectured there for 5 or 6 years. And I thought, well, they don't start till September, why have I got to get down? But it so happened that a gentleman with a large farm in north of the county had been asked by the ministry to go to America on a mission. And he said he wasn't going unless somebody could keep an eye on his farm manager for the harvest. So it so happened this man, Ronald Farquharson, he was an outstanding man, JP, and very much involved in many things. And well, quite honestly, from then on we really got on wonderfully. And he used to call me, or when he came from the nephew meeting on a Saturday, he'd come down here for tea. And I mean, he'd invite Christine and myself up there. And just one of his favourite things was to get a horse and trap out so I could drive the trap. But that was very good. But that was why I came down then. And, well, it takes a while to get used to a new district and a new what one did in the meantime, well, as I say, continue to do your best in helping people. And then in 1952, I remember I came here in 51. In 1952, there was a shopping week in Dorchester, and I was in Diggs. And it so happened there was a military tattoo at the barracks. And I went there. And because of the variation in the windows of the shops on shopping week, I walked down the high street, and who should be there? It was Christine and her mother. So, that was the first time I'd met her since over a year before. Well, we looked at the shop windows and whatnot. And then, because she worked at County Hall, and our cars, our cars sometimes passed each other, she'd wave. But then one Saturday, soon after, as we used to work 5.5-day week, I was driving up to my digs up the road, and there was Christine, with her father's Austin 7, stopped. And I thought, were they seeing in trouble? So I stopped. But the long and short of that, following that, we went to the theatre in Weymouth that night. And that then continued until, as I say, we got engaged in 1954. And we had a lot in common, particularly with the church side, you see. And frequently we were at Stafford where she was playing in the morning, and probably in St. Peter's, which I used to go to in Dorchester together, which was very good.
And what was it that endeared you to her?
I don't know. These things happen, don't they? How did it happen to you? You don't know, really. Well, she was clean, tidy, respectable. I would think nice, with her mother and herself. It was just, I couldn't have done better. And
what did you like to do together when you were courting?
Well, that's a job to know. It's a long time ago. We were involved, yes, in several groups, I remember. And did what we could. We didn't go out. We didn't, go to the theatre or the cinema very often. There wasn't the money. When I was transferred to Dorset in 1951, I was on $200 a year. Well, in 1954, because I then had a responsibility allowance, and then by 1954, it was probably $500 a year. So, well, as I say, we had common interests, and we also had a colleague of mine and now his wife. So we used to, yes, we'd go together or whatnot. But strange part about it is we never went to pubs. I was not, like the locals at Wise Van always wanted me to come out but I wouldn't. No, not interested.
Do you have a fond memory of her from those early days that springs to mind?
Well, I think it's the only lady who stopped her car and hoped that I would stop. I think she was in trouble, but she wasn't. Well, no, everything just clicked, which our interests generally, apart from she was not interested in gardening or anything like that, were very similar, let's put it that way. And if you're, as you know, if you're traditionally looking for get married sometime, but you want to get married when you're going to be married for life. And I thought there was a stability and consideration. So, yes. Well, then that was in 1952. In 1953, remembering also that the first we met, it was in 1952 when we met again. It was in the August time. So in 1953 we did go, well, I was out to Gloucester and on a holiday together. Although it's a different world today, you know. So then we decided, I presume, to get married. I used to get on well with her mother, and they're very well accepted, I would say. And the question is, if you're going to get married, where are you going to live? Well, houses, you'd have a license to build a house in 54, but a builder could have a license to build 12. Well, there was work-wise, I knew this builder. We were building grain stores that I designed and all that. And he said he was going to build some out here. Well, I came and had a look. It was the road was marked out, and the ground was covered in snow. It ended here. We were to be the last one, and that was in spring at 54. So we thought, well, we'd get plans or tell them what we wanted, and we sort of get an estimate and the like. So the long and short of it was we thought, well, yes, we were engaged, so we would obviously get married. Well, it's always a job with the money, isn't it? And fortunately, I'd taken out an endowment policy for a couple of thousand when I had this responsibility allowance, which helped. Anyway, we got the plans and all for this. We were going to feel opposite side of the road to begin with, but they were going to build a house here. We didn't want that. So anyway, the plot, including the road and the front wall, was £500. The building, the whole thing was sort of somewhere about 2,200, but then it was 2 bedrooms. It was quite an active time then, work-wise, preparing for work, and then, as I say, Kingston would like people who lectured having letters after their name. So in the July, I took the National Diploma in Agricultural Engineering, which fortunately they asked me the right questions or something, because it wasn't plain agriculture, it's agricultural science, crop production and mechanisation, and farm buildings and the whole lot. And well, then we were decided to get married on Christine didn't want to get married on a Saturday because of all the children that she taught in Sunday school. But anyway, we got married on a Tuesday, September the 7th, 1954. And she stayed at work for a year or so. And then in 1958, when Susan was born, and then Anne and Trish later on.
And tell me a little bit more about your wedding day. What are your memories of that day?
Well, some of my friends and mother and father already came out for the wedding. It was at West Stafford, because that was Christine's church. And Reverend Corbett Winder conducted the service. It was nice to see, his friends tried to be reasonably economical. I mean, Christine was taken to church with this work colleague of mine, so there was an expense that way. And then we went after the church. We used the old schoolroom at West Stafford for the reception. And, it wasn't a very sunny day or anything. We'd booked in at a hotel at Exeter, but it wasn't very pleasant. The next day we went down into Cornwall, but decided it was dull, and so then we went up to Gloucester here. So, but then the bungalow wasn't ready, was it? On September the 7th or 12th. Anyway, so I stayed over at Christine's mum and dad, and it was ready by November the 5th. And that's when we moved in. I won't say that Christine was very keen to move in, if you get what I mean, because her home and so on, but nonetheless, we did, and then we tried to settle down and do what we could. So she continued to do her organ playing and various other things, and I seemed to get landed with a lot of things. Whenever there was anything, I always seemed to have to be the chairman. I was chairman of our social club at the office, organising Christmas lunches and that, and then our church pattern was West Stafford and Broad Lane, depending on the requirement for the organ playing. Both Christine and myself have always taken an interest in the community in which we live. Maybe sometimes one put too much effort into it, but nonetheless, if each can do what little, but if each will do that little, all will be done. Now, you do nothing from rivalry or conceit, but in humility and not significant for yourself. Our involvement, I've made a little list here, things since we've been here. I was church warden here for 18 years. I was Parent Teachers and Friends Association chairman at this village school, and during that time we built a swimming pool, a heated swimming pool. I had a nice lot of group of people around me, which was very good. Civil Service Retirement Fellowship, locally chairman. Institution of Agricultural Engineers, South West England chairman. Institution of Agricultural Engineers on the council in London. I've done so many show commentaries and many conferences. One thing I've been very proud of, which I can't do anymore, is that I used to do the remembrance service at the War Memorial, and must have done it for 30 years and did the whole lot. The question of the school again, I was chairman of the governors of the school. I was chairman at one time of the Dorset Youth Orchestra, very much involved with the Broadwain Hall and building it. On the parish council for 34 years. And other things which I've been proud of. I don't like walking over graves. And towards the end of the 1990s, I said we want a graveyard extension, which people said, well, even then Parsons said, if people want to be buried, they can be buried in Dorchester. I didn't agree. Anyway, after a lot of toing and froing, we managed to buy some land from Salisbury Diocese, and we got a decent sized burial ground. And then people getting it, oh, it's too big, it'll last 200 years. I said, so what? Very good. But you got a job to win. Two other things which I was very pleased to do was my relations with some sisters who lived in the village. Interesting, the sisters are, there were 5 of them, 4 I knew. Their father was the clergyman at Sturminster Marshall. He got married, went on his honeymoon to Italy, and his wife died. But then later on he got married again, but he had these 5 sisters, and 3 of them lived in the village. 2 were very active, the other was not very well. And they were extremely kind and helpful, and I got on well with them. And one who didn't live in the village, who I also got on well with, she was a nurse in the First World War. In the Second War, in France, the Second World War, they wrote to her and asked her if she'd come again, and she did. And then when the Germans came, but she wanted to get home, managed to get her way one way and the other down into Portugal, thinking there may be a ship going to the UK, and in the harbour was a Sunderland flying boat. But she saw an RAF man and they brought her back to Poole. But she did an awful lot of good. And one of the things which I will say, when her sisters died and they had provided a surgery in the village, she rang me up and said, oh, always Mr. Bradshaw. Oh, Mr. Bradshaw, I think we'll give the surgery to the NHS. I said, that's very kind of you, Miss Violet, but why don't you give it to the parish council? Oh, she did. Well, then over the last few years, there was another surgery, but that's another gone. But the village hall that we built in the 1980s, which was very good, and we wanted to do some improvements, but you can't get grants if you've got a decent hall. But they sold the old surgery for £140,000 because she'd given it to the parish council. It hadn't been for our relationship. And the other one was the burial ground, there we have said, but the allotments, they used to be down in the village. And then we wanted the field for a playing field, so the allotments were moved, and it was on a 5-year lease. After 15 years, the lease hadn't been renewed. And when we found that out, well, I was delegated to deal with it. And fortunately, well, I had a lot to do with it, the solicitor and Wimborne with their solicitors. But in the end, Monica rang up, oh, Mr. Bradshaw, we will give it the village. And I do feel, really, there's a lot to be said for, well, what I would say, trying to live as best as you can and help people. Do nothing for rivalry or conceit. And the other thing is very important, I think, is good manners. Good manners cost nothing. We were brought up to say thank you. During my life, I have never been afraid to say thank you. And normally does this to speak on behalf of yourself and others. And I mean, there's so many things in the village when I was unable to attend. So they tend to say nobody get up and say thank you. Well, it's easy, no problem, is it? So.
You've been at the heart of the community here in Broadmead for a long time.
Yes. But I mean, you can't do what you did. But I will say, I mean, among the things which I've been proud of is having a group of people we could work together. I mean, for instance, I got photographs here of me handing cheques to this hospice where I go for £2,700 that I raised in the village, and likewise for Macmillan and MRI scanner, all sorts of things. Because if you get a group of people around you, good treasurer, good secretary, and workers, I always seem to get the job as being chairman. But nonetheless, it's a great honour to do things for other people.
And tell me about your Christian faith and what impact that's had on your life.
The first thing I can remember about my life is not the Christian side, but when I was 4, I was taken to a children's hospital to have my tonsils and adenoids out. That's the only first thing I remember. And I went in, the Coleman took me in his lorry, and I think it broke down on the way. I can't remember my very early age. That was 4 years old. A little bit later, 6 and that, yes. Well, we used to go to our church, and also it was common to go to the church, then go to Sunday school, and then later in the afternoon to go down to the Methodist chapel. That was when we were in our formative years. Then, of course, we joined the choir in the church. The parson really worked hard, and I think he achieved it. We had Bible class in one evening of the week, and my involvement with the church is in youth as a server, as well as in the choir, and anything to do with the church. In more recent years, then up until a year ago, I would read the lessons in West Stafford and on the rota in Broadvein, and used to do the intercessions as well, and also anything one could do, which really I enjoyed doing.
And what does having a faith mean to you day to day? How does it help you?
Well, it helped me with my prayers, and sometimes you have doubts. I think everyone has doubts from time to time, but nonetheless, quite honestly, it's good living and practicing what you preach, and doing what you can to help other people. Do what you can.
Okay, so we've heard about how you met Grandma. So tell us about your 3 daughters and what it was like when they were born.
Well, I mean, the fact that they were 3 girls, didn't really matter, did it? They say that girls or stay with you, whereas boys, tend to go with their wives. But I don't know whether that's very true. But I was, very pleased, and we were very fortunate that they were healthy. And we've been extreme. I don't like the word lucky, fortunate. And we've been very fortunate. And in their different ways, they've done different things.
And can you remember anything about the day that they were born, each of them?
Well, of course, they were all born in hospital, compared with the home confinements that one can have. And it's getting more normal now, isn't it? But, you see, when you see that little girl or little babe, it makes you appreciate there's somewhere somebody who has engineered the whole thing.
And how did you choose their names?
Well, I think to a degree, it's a long time ago, there's more a tendency for the mother and maybe her mother. But it's associated with something, but I don't really know how, when, or, you know, and Christine Mary, Susan Mary, and I don't really know.
Okay. And do you have any fond memories of the early days of having the three girls?
Oh yes, yes. Well, one thing when they were mobile was fencing them in, which then we could all play together. Before they were all mobile, well, we would go for a walk, take them out in the pram, and you could do that, but you can't now. Go along the main road and up to Culliford Tree and down here. We used to have quite a bit of fun together, and I think there was probably, in those days, there were a little more, not exactly distance, but the mum was in charge. But I mean, you get the job of changing the nappies as well. But of course, in those days, it were washable nappies. But no, I mean, well, we've just, you go and you treat them how you expect. I mean, I remember taking your mum in the field and telling her out what the cattle did when they wanted to go to the toilet. That she did, she should say rather than, but there we are.
And do you have a favourite family holiday memory? Going away together?
As young children, I did some work for a farmer in Devon. Pelham Reid was his name. He was not in my area, but there was an accountant who was involved with him, and he wanted me to design a grain plant and do things there. So I did, and he had a cottage, and we went down there for a holiday. And then when we got older, see, they don't necessarily want to go. Patricia wouldn't want to go. I mean, I used to like to go to France and Germany and the like, but Trish would want to stay home. So we weren't together. And of course, partly a question of economics.
And how have the priorities in your life shifted over time as you were a single man and then you got married and then went on to have children and grandchildren and now great-grandchildren?
Well, the fact is that one can treat them better now because, quite honestly, things aren't as tight. There's odd bits of friction at odd times, has been, but on the other hand, as a family, we do get on to, you may think, oh, well, better keep your mouth shut, Bradshaw, but nonetheless, we did get on well. And I mean, it was a fact with our own family. I mean, I know people who probably speak to each other once a year. My three sisters, I speak to very regularly. And I think it's, yes.
What's the hardest thing that you've had to go through or deal with in your life?
When your wife dies. And yes, that's probably the hardest. And then in order to do things for other people, you know, when Christine's father died, collapsed in Dorchester and died, and was in the mortuary, of course, somebody had to do identification, so that was me. And then when Beryl, my favourite sister, the one born in 1930, her husband had a heart attack and died. They lived in Cheltenham. And, I mean, so we went up there, and she and I went in to identify him. I don't want that job very often. The older you get, the less you want to do it, strangely enough. Otherwise, no, compared to a lot of people, I've been fortunate. Grateful for it too.
And when Grandma died, that was obviously a very hard time for you. What was it that kept you going through that?
Well, I think one's belief and the support you got. But you don't want it to happen. But then, like the girls say, if I'd have died before Mum, where would she have lived? Because it's the diabetes, you see, and having hypos, you couldn't live on your own. But, well, I'm not one to get married again. I mean, I have a friend. His first wife died. Then he married a girl who I knew. She'd been divorced from her husband, the farmer's wife, so I knew very well. And unfortunately, she died 18 months ago. And when I was with him in this July, he's getting married again. You know, and you think, well, really, I shouldn't want to be like that.
It's not what you choose.
No. No. But I think one of the things does give you is involvement in the industry. You know, I mean, the fact that in the animal kingdom, whether it's cattle, sheep, pigs, or chicken, there's something magical about it. There's something magical about it. You plant some, depending whether it's winter barley, winter wheat, spring barley, whether it's oilseed rape. These things come up, don't they? How's it done? I just don't know. But it is done. Why is it that you get... We know for a fact that, I mean, the winter barley harvests will start, generally speaking, second half of July. We know that. And we know the oilseed rape will be ready just before. Who does it? Who controls?
And looking back on your life as a whole, so thinking about your work, but also your family life and your church life, what is it that's given you the greatest joy?
Well, I think what gives the greatest joy that you haven't made silly mistakes and done things wrong. What you've done is try to do your job properly. And I know, I mean, like the office used to open at 8:30, but usually it was 10 to 9 before I got to work. So the admin side could go, but then 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock at night, Christine's many times rung up the hospital in the place to see if I've had an accident. Communication wasn't so good, so if you're in the middle of fields then, and well, I call my job was a hobby job, if you get what I mean. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Challenging, demanding, oh yes. And, well, I used to do a lot of homework, wasn't recognised then, you know, but I used to do a lot of drawing of grain store plans out there on the table with a drawing board. And, yes. And I've met some very nice people. I've been extremely fortunate. And, yes, but as I say, but particularly I like the Chalkland because it was on a big scale, and more than not likely the money was more available to build these things, because we're building a couple of 1,000-ton grain store and 2 dryers and all that. You know, it was a lot of money, but nonetheless essential if one's going to follow a farming pattern with cereal growing.
And is there something that you can tell me that I might be surprised to learn about you?
You'd be surprised to see my school report. No, I don't think you'd be surprised at anything, because your standard of life is something similar to my standard of life, and therefore I don't think there's anything. I mean, I haven't got to have a dozen kids to do wrong with them.
What would your dream be for your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren?
Well, firstly, I'd like them to be healthy. I'd like them to be honourable to their parents and the religion. But the parents are priority. I want them to be dedicated, courteous, good-mannered, and nobody can get all the top jobs, but I would like them to be capable and able. And what's more, loving and kind to their associates.
And what piece of advice would you give them and their contemporaries, the generations that follow?
Well, if we forget politics, well, first thing is, you must never advise them to do anything that you have doubt and no confidence in, and it's a risk. You want them really, I feel, to be, well, respectful, as I said, dedicated, and without... it's very difficult to say, but the future is very different. The future of your dear little daughter and 1940 is so tremendous. It's very difficult to associate and tie up with it. Extremely difficult. But I want them to be happy, contented, and loving.